History is written by the winners, but it is survived by the monsters. We like to imagine our ancestors as simple, noble hunter gatherers, but the archaeological record paints a much bloodier portrait of the human species. 400,000 years ago, the Heidelberg people were not just surviving, they were arguably the most dangerous creatures on the planet. Deep within the Cima de los Huesos cave in Spain, archaeologists discovered the remains of 28 individuals. Their skulls show blunt force trauma, repetitive blows delivered with lethal precision. This wasn't an accident. This was a mass execution, or perhaps a ritualized murder. It marks the oldest known evidence of homicide in the history of our lineage. We tell ourselves that brutality is a modern invention, a byproduct of civilization, agriculture, or greed. The science suggests the opposite. The further back we go, the more relentless the violence becomes. Consider the Neanderthals. For decades, they were depicted as clumsy, simple-minded brutes. We now know they were sophisticated, empathetic, and highly capable. They buried their dead and cared for their sick. But they were also cannibals. At the Goyet Caves in Belgium, researchers found skeletal remains from 35,000 years ago. The bones show clear, undeniable signs of butchery. They weren't just eating deer and mammoth. They were skinning, disarticulating, and marrow-cracking their own kind. The cut marks match exactly with the processing of game animals. This wasn't a desperate act of starvation either. It was a calculated part of the social fabric. Then there is us, Homo sapiens. We arrived on the scene and systematically pushed every other human species toward extinction. We didn't do it with diplomacy. We did it with superior numbers, better projectile weaponry, and an unmatched capacity for organized violence. Between 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, human population density exploded. As groups expanded, competition for territory turned lethal. Look at the Nataruk site in Kenya. 10,000 years ago, a group of hunter-gatherers was ambushed near the shores of Lake Turkana. 27 individuals were slaughtered. Their bodies were left in the mud to decompose. Some had arrowheads embedded in their skulls. Others had their hands bound. Their knees were shattered. This is the earliest known site of a prehistoric massacre. It proves that war is not a byproduct of the state or private property. It is a fundamental feature of the human software. We have a habit of romanticizing the Paleolithic, imagining a peaceful existence in harmony with nature. In reality, the mortality rate from interpersonal violence in many hunter-gatherer societies has been estimated by anthropologists to be as high as 15 to 20%. For comparison, if we had that same rate today, we would be seeing millions of murders every single year in the United States alone. Our ancestors were apex predators who viewed other humans as the only real threat to their survival. We evolved to be hyper-tribal, fiercely protective of our own, and absolutely ruthless toward the outsider. That instinct didn't vanish when we learned how to grow wheat or build cities. It just got scaled up. The monsters didn't leave. They just learned how to use bureaucracy and technology to mask their bloodthirst. We still carry the same brain structure, the same amygdala, and the same physiological drive for dominance that compelled those prehistoric groups to hunt their neighbors. We look at a skull from 400,000 years ago and see a relic of a primitive era. We should be looking at it as a mirror. What if the violence we see in our news cycle isn't a failure of our current society, but the default setting of our species? We praise ourselves for our progress, for our law, and for our global cooperation, but underneath the veneer of high-speed internet and international trade, the same prehistoric impulse to conquer the other remains active. Perhaps the most terrifying thing about the history of humanity isn't how much we've changed, but how little we've actually evolved. We are still the same creatures who left the bodies in the cave in Spain. We just have better weapons and more sophisticated justifications. The question isn't why ancient humans were monsters. The question is why we still pretend we aren't. As we look toward the future, we have to acknowledge that the capacity for total annihilation is not an external threat. It is hardwired into the history of who we are. The next stage of human evolution won't be physical. It won't be another upgrade to our tool making capacity or our cognitive reach. It will have to be a fundamental, conscious override of the monster we've been since the very beginning. If we cannot outsmart the instinct that drove our ancestors to slaughter one another in the mud of Kenya or the caves of Spain, then we are simply waiting for the inevitable repeat of our own history. The cycle of violence is not an aberration, it is the story of us. And until we stop telling ourselves the fairy tale of the noble savage, we will remain trapped in the same patterns that define the species from the very first strike. We are the descendants of the survivors, and we carry their history in our bones. Whether we repeat that history is the only choice that actually matters.